must be the fence expert. Who's that guy in that orange shirt? Who must be the fence expert? It's almost time to talk about the fences. It's time to discuss operations and expenses. It's time, it's really time to elevate small businesses. It's time to put Joe and drop his knowledge, it's relentless. This rhyme of mine is getting a bit ridiculous. So here we go, we're live with Joe. Enjoy the show.
What is up, Fence fam? So good to be back with you guys virtually, as it were. It's been a minute. Hope you guys had a great Thanksgiving. Hope you got to see all the friends and family that you wanted to. Hope you got everything you wanted, out of the Thanksgiving experience. Hope everyone's doing super well. Also, hope you guys have had a killer week. The first week back from a holiday, from a long weekend holiday, is always a bit tough. So hope you guys navigated through that okay. For those of you that we met down at Tony Thornton's second annual Fence Business Conference, hope everybody made it back okay. It was even weirder. So we had a long weekend for the Thanksgiving, and then we were down in Branson for Tony's event. Like I said, if you went there, you know all about it, obviously, but it was a great success. We met a lot of good people. One of the people we didn't necessarily meet, but we saw again. You've seen him here on the show before, Andrew Martin with Atlas Financial. Last time we met with him, we were talking about building a solid financial foundation for your business. Now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into it. Hey guys, if you're listening to this on the podcast, you're listening to a recorded version of a live conversation I host most every Saturday starting at 10 a.m. Central, and it goes till the conversation's done, usually around 11-ish. But if you're listening to this, you should probably go back and listen to Andrew's interview with us earlier where we talked about financial foundations, creating that strong financial foundation, because this conversation builds on that. You don't want to build a house on a shaky foundation. We're going to get into a few deeper topics today. So anyway, if you guys are watching, of course, I hope you watch that as well. You can always go back and watch these as recorded lives wherever you catch video content, whether it's YouTube, LinkedIn, TikTok, wherever, Facebook or Meta, X, I don't know, wherever you get Facebook video content, there's a good chance it's probably there. And if it's not, let us know, because maybe there's a new thing and we need to go be there. Anyway, guys, without further ado, the one and the only, Andrew Martin.
Morning, Joe. Thanks for having me, man. And I just want to echo what you said about Tony Thornton's event. It was a really great experience, a lot of great information. The speakers there were amazing. And I forget who said it, but something along the lines of like, the entire industry was invited, and there was, I forget how many people, less than 75 people there.
Yeah.
And there should have been hundreds, right? But I mean, it really was. It was incredibly well done, just as far as the organization and layout of everything, and then the speakers were all top notch.
It was jam packed.
Yeah.
So the speakers kind of all sat back together, and I'd look around, and it was funny. Even the majority, if not all the speakers were all back there with me, just kind of taking notes as well. It's like, listen, will I come speak for free? Yes, because if it gets me in this room with this crowd listening to these speakers, that's worth it. It makes it absolutely worth it.
Absolutely.
So who said that was Dominic from Profit Tool Belt. Up in Canada, and he started off with that sentiment. He's like, what's crazy is the entire industry was invited, and the point he was making is those of you that are in the room right now, it should have been hundreds. Those of you that are in the room right now are the ones that value ongoing education. You're investing in your success, that sort of thing. Because it was a bit of an investment, just in nothing else than time. It was the Monday after Thanksgiving, so. It was the guys and gals that made a point of being there really did commit to, furthering themselves personally, furthering their businesses, that sort of thing.
Well, and I thought it was a really great layout as far as the 2 days, because sometimes, it's a lot of information. It's a whole day, you know what I mean? And so once it starts getting into like 4 or 5 days, something like that, sometimes a little bit of kind of mental fatigue or something like that. So anyways, I thought it was all top notch.
Yeah. And they were 2 full days, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. thereabouts. It was actually the second day, Tuesday, went till about 5:30. Tony was on a roll. But it was all good stuff. Sometimes, and I don't want to point fingers at other conferences, but sometimes you'll go to a conference where you can pick out like the top 2 or 3 speakers. We say, hey, I'm really glad I got to sit in on this one and this. I felt like the entire 2 days was worthwhile of sitting and just absorbing, trying to get as much of that soaked in as possible.
I would 100%. And I would say, I'm guessing, but I would imagine there was at least 1 or 2 things from every speaker that somebody was able to take away and those golden nuggets that we talk about. So, I mean, I think every speaker had at least a few things. Because I've gone to conferences like that too, where people can kind of pop in and out to things or something like that. And just for sake of time or, whatever else, so they might not go to everything, and you never know what you're missing. So, it was very well done.
It was. Location was great. It was down in Branson, Missouri, right on the Branson Landing. So there's food options right there. There was some people went shopping. Some people went into town, went over to Silver City. So it was also a great location that fairly easy to get to. Like, it wasn't like a fly-in destination though. Flew into Springfield and then drove 45 minutes ish down to Branson.
Yeah.
But
no, Branson,
I think the drive was worth it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, so last time you and I spoke, we talked on this show, we talked about building the financial foundation for yourself, insurance and savings, and making sure your bases are covered first.
Yep.
Which that's all the stuff is. And I would, not obviously being in the financial sector, but I would think those are probably the hardest things for people to do, just because it's always a hope I don't need this. But
Yeah.
you gotta, but when someone ever looked at the foundation of their house and gone, man, that's a great looking foundation. Like that is done really well. It's the same with a house or a building. Is the foundation never gets the praise. It's the actual structure that's built on top of it. Unless the foundation is weak, and then you see cracks all the way up the building. I mean, older buildings, you see that quite a lot.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Everything's built on top of the foundation, so you barely see it, right? Nobody pays attention to it. Nobody cares what color it is, or if there's pretty bows on it, or any of that stuff. It's the it's the least sexy part of a house, right? But
absolutely,
but arguably the most important, right? So, and then, like you said, I mean, if there's a problem with the foundation, it's very hard to fix. Everything that sits on top of the foundation has a problem as well. And it just, at that point, it either is maybe unfixable or costs a lot more to fix than just getting it right the first time. So, I mean, just kind of a brief recap. I mean, as far as your financial foundation, it's the insurances, it's the property casualty insurance like home and auto umbrella, it's the health insurance, it's the life insurance and disability insurance. It's the emergency fund. It's the estate planning, which I just will say about estate planning. Like I said last time, I mean, I've been doing this for, 14-ish years, and I could count on one hand how many people I've met with throughout my entire career who have their estate planning done and up to date when meeting with them.
Yeah.
And everybody knows they need to get it done. Everybody, every time we bring it up, people are like, "Oh yeah, we've been meaning to get it done. We know we need to get it done, whatever," and they just don't. And it just kind of takes us reminding them and keeping them accountable to it to get it done. And it's just kind of one of those strange things. But I think, to your point, all the things on the foundation, none of them are sexy. None of them like make you money, so to speak, or anything, right? Yeah. They're all things that you hope you never have to use, and you hope is kind of a waste of money and all that other sort of stuff. But I mean, I could really bore you with a ton of examples of people who, had that stuff or didn't, and something happened, and they were either very, very glad they had it, or they were very sorry they didn't and wish they did. All right. So
absolutely. I want to key in on something you said just right there, is that making sure it's up to date. This isn't a set it and forget it type thing either, because hopefully your business is growing, your personal, wealth or your personal valuation is growing to where that at a minimum, the insurance needs to keep pace with that. I'll tell a story. I might have told it last time about insurance. Our insurance agent was telling us the story. This is years ago. Actually, he was presenting to a group, but talking about make sure everything's up to date. So making sure it's assigned to the correct person in your life that it should be assigned to. He had a client pass away, and instead of going and visiting the wife, he went and visited the ex-wife because she was the beneficiary on the policy, because this policy was 15 years old, 20 years old. And he said, you want to talk about, and I got to have two uncomfortable conversations. One with the ex-wife saying why it wasn't a particularly good breakup. And so she's like, why are you here? I don't want anything to have to do with this or anything. And he's like, I get that. However, like I have to follow what's on the documents here. And It says that I'm supposed to come talk to you about this. And then the other uncomfortable conversation is the wife who shows up saying, hey, he said, because they had part of what you had talked about last time is have the conversation. So people know what's there, who to talk to, where all the documents are. And so the wife says, hey, he talked about having this life insurance policy. It's like, ooh, yeah, that's true. And now you two need to discuss this. And I guess that was, so there's 3 very uncomfortable conversations that came out of that.
Yeah.
So up to date is something I think is worth talking about.
And it's such an easy fix, man. It really is such an easy fix. It's just, and I get it. People are busy and they got stuff going on, and it's just not
Yeah.
stuff that you spend a lot of time thinking about. But yeah, we've had similar issues go on where a young lady, her husband passed away. She was like 30ish at the time. This was years ago, and they had, I think, a 4 or 6-year-old daughter. I can't remember, a young daughter. And the husband had his ex-wife listed as beneficiary on his 401k and had his parents listed as beneficiary on the life insurance. And so, I mean, she got virtually nothing, right? Besides the Social Security that his daughter got to claim, the survivorship Social Security. But it, it's just very easy. I mean, we were doing a 401k with a 401k review with a client the other day, and he's newly married, and we always make sure every time. So obviously anything that we control for a client, we're able to go in and see and make sure that beneficiary is up to date and all that. But like a 401k is something that like we can advise on and help with, but we don't control, right? So we logged in with him, we were poking around. I was like, all right, first thing, let's make sure we have beneficiaries up to date and all that other sort of stuff. He had no beneficiaries listed. Right. So his wife wasn't on there at all. And I was like, all right, well, let's make sure to get that taken care of, which he was very happy we got done. But a lot of people don't necessarily realize that any beneficiary designations override whatever it says in your will. So you could have in your will that,
Okay.
like, if you have your estate planning done and up to date, which, is a big if, but, you could say, oh, everything passes to my wife or whatever. But if you have your ex-wife listed as beneficiary on your life insurance or retirement or whatever else, it doesn't matter what it says in your will. The beneficiary designation overrides whatever that says, and your ex-wife will end up getting it. So you still have to make sure that beneficiaries are up to date on everything, including bank accounts. They call it, instead of beneficiary, they call it a paid on death or POD. And then some accounts, like maybe you have an investment account with whatever, TD Ameritrade or Acorns or whatever. It's called TOD, or transfer on death. So it's just a little bit different, but you have to make sure to go in there and properly do that to make sure that there isn't a lot of that. It doesn't have to go through probate, and there's not a lot of nonsense that somebody has to deal with on top of your passing.
Right.
If and when that were to happen.
Well, and that's a good point about probate, because so if there's not a beneficiary, if there's none of that, it all gets wrapped up in probate court, which I don't have direct experience, but you talk to people who've had experience, and I don't know anybody that walks out of the probate process thinking they got a great deal. Just really saying, hey, that went exactly how I hoped it would go and everything went smoothly. It's typically a no-winner situation, where, because you're asking someone that has no background with the history dynamics of the family or whomever's involved. There's just an outside third party that's going, okay, well, I guess this is fair, I guess that's fair. They're wanting to make sure they're basically looking out for the best interest of the estate without knowing any information about the estate or the players in it or anything like that. So
yeah, they don't know family dynamics. They don't know, relationships or any of that stuff. And I think people drastically underestimate the potential cost of probate as well, because some of these attorneys will charge, kind of like on personal injury, where they charge a percentage of what they help you claim, typically a third, 25% to a third or something like that, maybe 40%. The same can be done on probate, where they're getting a percentage of the estate for helping you, through that process. And, we had some clients just this past week that he was kind of telling me, he's like, I got some uncles, they own, hundreds of property, hundreds of acres, right on this river. And they kind of, pulled up the Google Maps and stuff. Beautiful property. And they're like, it's two twin uncles that never been married, no kids, any of that stuff. My dad is the only other, like real family member they have, this, that, and the other. And they're like, so, they're in their 80s, and we're imagining we might inherit some of this property at some point. But they were like, they are super, super, I don't want to say do-it-yourselfers, like just not doers. You know what I mean? Like they probably haven't done anything at all.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, you better find a way to encourage them to see an estate planning attorney, because kind of walked them through what's going to happen. And I was like, well, something like that, I mean, it's going to cost probably hundreds of thousands of dollars in the probate process for this, and then it's going to take years, and there's going to be a lot of infighting within family members and stuff like that, and all the ugliness is going to come out. So it could be very easily taken care of by spending probably $3,000 to $5,000, going to see an attorney, have it all taken care of, and it would save you hundreds of thousands of dollars, years, and a lot of headache. Right? So,
well, Shane has that comment in here where he knows somebody that kind of went through a situation like that. He's got a buddy that passed away about a year ago. All of his stuff, business, land, everything is in a probate and still messing with it, which is a mess. And it's typically these things, just from what I've heard, and it sounds like you had echoed this similar sentiment. These are a year is fast track. These are multiple year situations, because it's not, hey, let's sit around a conference room and hash this out. It's, all right, we're going to have the initial meeting or the initial hearing, and then we're going to have you got to file motions. It's a court proceeding, really. And so it's
nonsense. Yeah.
It drags out. And really, I mean, the only ones that win out of that probably are the attorneys that are representing, the different sides.
Yeah. And I got a lot of attorney friends, so I don't mean to,
no,
but
that's a profession.
Yes. Yeah. But that's what I'm saying. I don't mean to, say anything negatively, but yes,
no,
they're pretty much the only winners out of that, because they're going to get paid for their time and all that stuff. But
they'll have staff, and I mean, it's a business like everything else.
Sure.
So but I think the point here is that you would not want to pass that headache down to anybody, as well as if you get all your ducks in a row, you wouldn't want to willingly just give money away to someone to try to hash out something you should have hashed out to begin with. Is that you could save a lot of money just by doing this up front and ensure, because your affairs better than anybody. So you could ensure, okay, they're going to say this, but based on my history with this, I think this is the way. And in the end, really, you're distributing your stuff, whether it's stocks, whether it's land, whether it's whatever it is. So anyway, this is where foundational stuff comes in. Yeah.
And then I know, one last thing, and I know we'll move on from the foundational stuff, because that's not supposed to be what today's conversation
this is important.
About. But yeah, we, we're working with a client now, and, middle-aged guy, he's got, multiple adult children. And, he's got a business that's probably worth $12 to $15 million, something like that. And, has his estate planning done, has it, I say up to date, I mean, reasonably up to date and things like that. And so we're reviewing everything. He hired us to kind of go through and kind of give a, second set of eyes on stuff, and just, help him plan, and so on and so forth. So, we have our team review, trust documents and estate planning documents and things like that. And so what he says he wants to happen, and what he says he fully believes the trust and estate planning documents say, isn't what the trust documents say. So in other words, he's like, well, he plans on selling the business in a handful of years, but he's like, if I die before I'm able to sell the business, then, my son, who is basically manager of the business right now, is going to sell it. He's going to get 10%, 10% gross of the sale proceeds. And then the wife will get the rest of it, and it'll go to the trust, and so on and so forth. Well, it says in the trust, first of all, when looking at his tax returns, trust documents, corporate documents, things like that. The name of his business is just a little bit different in almost all of them. So I'm like, all right, well, we need to get all this on the same page and it needs to be fixed. His name, because he's, he goes by kind of a nickname. And so they have his nickname in a lot of the documents and not his real legal name. They had his daughter's pre-marriage, name, maiden name, still in the documents. It said in the trust that his son was going to get 10% net of the proceeds. And basically his wife was going to get it, and then once it sells, she was going to give him the 10%. We're talking about millions of dollars. And I'm like, look, you're going to run into like gift tax issues. You're going to run into like, she's going to pay the taxes on it. She's going to like, there's all this other sort of stuff. And I'm like, here's a much easier way to do this. First of all, what you fully believe that all this says and what you think is going to happen and what you're, setting out to happen, it's not going to happen that way. And it's just I'm kind of sharing this story to say, even if you have your estate planning done and you have a trust or you have this, that, and the other, and you think, I got all this squared away, I'm a big believer in just, it would be worth maybe paying somebody else, maybe another attorney, maybe a firm like ours. It doesn't matter, but just like, hey, can you kind of go through these things to make sure that what I think is going to happen, that this stuff's, you know what I mean? Because
second set of eyes.
Yeah, I just, we humans make mistakes or we misunderstand things sometimes, and
or they might have also been prepared by several different professionals, right? Just through depending on how early you started and where you are in the process. We use a different legal firm now than we used 5 years ago.
Right.
So you saying that actually made me think. I was like, you know what? It's actually different guys that wrote part of it and that have wrote subsequent parts of it, just as the family grows and as the business grows. Yeah. So I can see how that could pretty easily get into some confusion. So having one set of eyes review all the documents is probably a great idea too.
Yeah, and that's and again, there's other firms out there that work the way we do. So I'm not trying to make this sound like a commercial for us or anything, but I just think, because attorneys live in the legal world, CPAs live in the tax world, financial advisors typically live in like the investment world, 90-something% of the time. So I just think finding a firm who can look at all of those things together and make sure everything is aligned the way it needs to be is incredibly valuable, because I just couldn't tell you how many times, again, CPAs living in his bubble, attorneys living in his bubble, whatever, and we end up looking at documents and I'm like, these don't jive, right? Because these people are not communicating, collaborating, or whatever, but like this doesn't flow together the way that it needs to, and nobody's going to catch it because the person doesn't know. I mean, like the average person doesn't speak that language, so to speak, just like I don't speak fence, right? So I mean, if you were telling me some sort of complicated thing about how to build a fence, I'm like, that sounds great, man. I don't know,
Sure.
I just
sounds
need
right.
A fence built,
right.
But somebody's got to catch it, and that somebody has to be you a lot of times.
Sure. So in recap of the recap, we firm foundation, right? But that's why it's worth spending so much time on, though, because if it's shaky, then once you start building on top of it, it could lead to everything coming down, right? If the foundation for whatever reason fails, or it could be really costly to try to unwind and rebuild later on. And that's why it's worth spending so much time now talking about it. That's how important it is. Because to your point, the stuff we're getting ready to talk about is more flashy, right? It is what people think about as in terms of making money with money, that sort of thing. And a lot of people probably leapfrog the boring stuff, get to the exciting stuff and say, we'll figure that out later, which isn't the right order. And often that it can't be in that order.
Agreed. Yeah. I mean, a lot of times you're leaving a lot of things really exposed unnecessarily if you're doing that sort of stuff. And, if a crack in the foundation became exposed and you started building on top of that, you know, shaky foundation, well, then in goes the house, right? So,
Mhm.
yeah, I will say, as it pertains to, so once you have your foundation set and you're
Yeah.
ready to build on top of it, so we're talking about like debt management, we're talking about investing, retirement planning. So whatever that means, whether that means investing in the market, investing in real estate, investing in your business, investing in cryptocurrencies, investing whatever you want to invest in, um, and more along those sorts of lines. There are, from what I find, little things that provide the most success, right? Everybody wants kind of the silver bullet and like, hey, how can I
Sure.
turn $1 into $1 million overnight kind of a thing? And I'm like, well, so I just had this conversation with a client this last week. Um, he's been with us for a couple years and he's an engineer, so he's very numbers minded and analytical and things like that. And so he, reached out to the office and he was like, hey, I want to see. I've been running numbers, and we've already ran numbers for him multiple, multiple times throughout the years, but he just always, yeah, it's just the way he works.
Mhm.
And he's like, I want to look at, if I can retire with, X amount of dollars, how long will it take me to get there? And then based on these different monthly budgets, how, X amount of dollars versus Y versus Z per month, how do things look? And so we ran all that and like it didn't, in certain cases didn't look that great. And I was like, look, first of all, I don't like running numbers based. One of the most common questions I get asked is like, how much money do I need to have saved or invested when I go to retire? And I'm like, well, that's not an unimportant question,
Sure.
but it's not the most important question, right? Or we're kind of looking at
Mhm.
it the wrong way. So instead of looking at what's more important than that is what your retirement income needs are or wants, right?
Mhm.
So on an after-tax basis. So as an example, as a kind of an egregious example of that, we worked with a gentleman, this was a number of years ago, sold his business. He was in his kind of mid to late, I think he was 57, 58 at the time. Um, Walked away with about $16 million after it was all said and done, right? So for the average person, late 50s, walking away with 16 million, probably you and I are thinking, oh, he's sitting pretty good, right? He should
Yeah.
he should be all right.
You probably figure
Um,
I could probably figure that out. Sure. Sure.
yeah, I think I could make that work, right? So, but this gentleman needed
Mm.
$1 million a year to live the lifestyle that he's accustomed to. So it's hard to make $1 million.
Okay.
It's hard to make $16 million last for potentially 40 years based on $1 million
Right.
a year
Right.
after tax income withdrawal rate or whatever, right? So,
Sure.
um, I kind of had that same conversation with this client of like, look, there are things we can control and things that we cannot. We cannot control our rate of return on investments. We can influence them, we can't control them, right?
Mm.
So, and there's just a lot of other things that we can't control as far as, if because he's got a lot of money invested in the market. I'm like, the market doesn't work linearly. There's going to be down years over the next
Mhm.
these handful of years that you're talking about. And I was like, statistically speaking, we're going to have at least one down year over this 5 year period of time. So I said, but what we can control is what we're doing with the money, and we can control our spending. We can't control what market returns are. We can't
Mhm.
control any of that other sort of stuff. We can't control what taxes are. There are
Sure.
things we can control and things that we cannot. So instead of everybody, and I'm not saying we shouldn't try to maximize the return on our investments, however it is that you're investing, again, in real estate or the market or whatever, but what we can control most is what we are doing with the money that we are given and how we are managing it. So that means things like managing income. And once you make money and once it comes in, where's that money going and where's it going to be most efficiently utilized? How we're managing debt and how we're managing our investments, right? So I just think people focus too much on the flashy things like, hey, how do I get this enormous return? And I'm willing to kind of make these speculative bets sometimes
Sure.
to, hope to get these outsized returns. And that might work out. And I always hope it does. But You can't control that, and there are things that you
Yeah.
can control. So I just think, and you would be surprised, especially if you're younger. If you're below 50 and you plan on retiring at like a normal retirement age of like say 60 plus, your income is far and away your biggest asset, and how you're managing that income when it comes in, how you're managing cash flow. And you could say the same thing for you, but these principles apply to your business as well as your personal financial situation. But
Sure.
how you're managing that cash flow and what you're doing with it when it comes in you're not going to see these big immediate impacts, but compounded long term, it will have far and away the biggest impact of as compared to anything else, right? So I mean, you might be swinging for the fences, and 1 out of 5, 1 out of 10 times you hit a home run as far as investments go, but managing cash flow and what you're doing with that money when it comes in. So I mean, we've ran numbers so many times for younger people, and it's just little. A lot of times there's no like huge changes we're making to their financial plan. It's just small things compounded over a long period of time, little inefficiencies that we're fixing, or little things that we could be doing a little bit better. Sometimes there are big changes and
Sure.
things like that, but for the most part, it's these little things, and there might be multiple of them, but these little things compounded over a multi-year, multi-decade period of time that ends up making a lot of times a multi-million-dollar difference, even for normal people with normal-ish incomes. But that compounded over a long period of time to and through retirement, a lot of times makes a seven-figure plus difference in dollar amount, just by doing the little things right over and over and over, and being as efficient as possible with the money that is coming in.
Makes sense. Makes sense. You can't squander it now and hope to have it later, sort of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I am not the type of person to tell people don't spend money,
Sure.
pinch pennies, do all the stuff, because I know a lot of people, and we've had clients and everything else, that people work their whole lives and they're getting close to retirement and die, or they've died right after retirement, or things like that. And that sucks. So,
Right. Right.
take the vacations, enjoy life now and stuff like that, but also be responsible and things like that. But I guess if we're kind of sectioning these things off, let's talk about debt. Let's talk about debt management first.
Okay.
So a couple things. There are two basic ways if you have multiple lines of debt. So whether they're credit cards, vehicles, mortgage, whatever it is, two basic ways when it comes to tackling debt. One called the snowball and one called the avalanche method. So the snowball might be the most well-known because it's the one that people like Dave Ramsey and stuff like that kind of preach about. And I don't think either is better than the other. And you'll see what I'm talking about as I go through. But the snowball, if we're going to use an example that I think is the easiest example I can think of. So let's say you have 3 different debts, one at 1,000 at 1% interest, one at 2,000 with 2% interest, and one at 3,000 with 3% interest. The snowball method is saying, well, we're going to attack the smallest debt first. So you're going to pay the minimums on all of them, but with any extra money that you have, it's going to go to the smallest dollar amount debt first, regardless of interest rate. So in this example, it would be the 1,000 at 1%. So even though it's the smallest interest rate, it's also the smallest dollar amount. So we're going to focus our attention on that one first. Then once that one's paid off, all the money that you were putting towards it goes towards the next smallest, which is our 2,000 at 2%, and so on until they're completely done. The avalanche is a little bit different. That same example, 1,000 at 1%, 2,000 at 2%, 3,000 at 3%. The avalanche is saying, well, we're going to attack the highest interest rate first, regardless of size.
Okay.
And so even though the 3% is our largest debt at $3,000, we're going to attack that 3% first because it is the highest interest rate.
Sure.
So there's what makes sense on paper, and then there's what makes sense to the person. Because when it
Okay.
comes to financial planning, it's not just dollars and cents. If it was just dollars and cents and math and numbers, this is the easiest job in the world. But there's emotions and psychology and kind of the human element to it as well. So some people are going to be very motivated by getting one of their three debts paid off as soon as possible, right? So it's kind of that mental,
Okay.
like, hey, I got one out of three done. That keeps me going. I'm motivated. We've knocked out one of the three. Now I just have two, and so on and so forth. And that's their focus, and that's what keeps them motivated. Some people are going to be more motivated by paying off, saving the most on interest, which means paying off the highest interest debt first, even if it takes them much longer to ultimately get one of those paid off, because it's the biggest one and it's just going to naturally take you longer. So some people get dragged down by that because they don't feel
Sure.
like they're making the process or progress, because they're like, well, I still got three debt, or three different types of debt, so on.
Yeah.
But some people, so on paper, the avalanche method makes more sense because you are going to
Right.
save more on interest by doing that. But psychologically, if you're the kind of person that's going to get bogged down and not be as motivated because you still see three, credit lines or three types of debt that you have, well, that's good to know. So there's not, if you're the type of, you just got to know these are the two kind of normal methods, or kind of most popular methods, and like which
Sure.
one's going to appeal, which one's going to appeal most to me and keep me motivated most. And that's the one I'm going to go with, whether it's the snowball or avalanche. So I'm an avalanche person because, again, just the
Yeah.
numbers. I want to know I'm saving the most on interest. I look at the debt as a whole, right? Instead of three different ones. But if you're the type of person that says, well, I view these as three separate ones and it's going to keep me motivated to get one knocked off, well, then go the snowball method. So
Sure.
there's not necessarily a right or wrong, but those are the two kind of basic ones. And then I'm sure people have heard or had the conversation with people about, well, we have these conversations with people all the time, and usually it centers around like a mortgage, where if they were lucky enough to have gotten in when mortgage rates were really good, and they have like a 3% interest on their mortgage or something like that. And again, this comes back down to numbers versus psychology. So from, let's say this person is paying extra towards their mortgage, because they're like, well, it's going to bring me a lot of comfort to know that I'm knocking off the mortgage and I get it paid off sooner. And I'm like, all right, well, but if you're paying 3% interest on the mortgage and you could invest that extra money and make even 4%, you're
Yeah.
net ahead that 1%, right?
Sure.
And so then people will counter that a lot of times and say, well, yeah, but once I get the mortgage paid off, like, it's going to bring me a lot of comfort to know that I don't have this, let's say, $2,000 or $3,000 mortgage or whatever it is. And it's like, okay, well, when you run the numbers, the extra that you're putting towards it, so instead of a 30-year loan, you're going to get it paid off, let's say, in 20 years. That's still 20 years that things can hit the fan, that you still have a $2,000 or $3,000 mortgage. So that's still a long time that things can still hit the fan, and you still have that payment. Also, if things did hit the fan, would you rather not have a $2,000 or $3,000 a month payment, or would you rather have tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting around somewhere that you could get your hands on if you were to need it? I think the answer is fairly clear in that example,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
now, having said that, we've had conversations with clients about that exact topic and showed them it really financially does not make a ton of sense to pay extra towards this 3% mortgage. And I could go into like tax
Yeah.
reasons and all the other stuff, right? But really doesn't make as much sense as taking that money and doing something else with it, which even today, high yield savings accounts are paying more than 3 or 4%. So, I mean, even zero risk effectively, you could still, you could still outdo that. But if somebody's like, I hear that, I appreciate the numbers, but it's really going to help me sleep better at night knowing that have the house paid off, great, we'll move forward with that assumption.
Sure.
It's my job to give you the numbers, right? But
Right.
um, just using that as an example of, if you have a low interest debt, and if you think that very reasonably you can make more than what you're paying on the debt by taking that extra money, obviously you got to make those payments, those minimum payments, but if you can take that extra money and invest it in whatever you want to invest in, and you feel like you can reasonably make a higher return than what you're paying on the mortgage, then that might make the most financial sense long term.
Sure. Absolutely.
But again, you got to know what makes sense to you.
Absolutely.
We have a client, two things. One, rule of thumb is 7%. So if you have a debt that the interest rate is higher than 7%, the rule of thumb is take any extra money you have and pay it towards that debt at, let's call it 8%, because you're basically getting a guaranteed 8% return, if you will, or savings by paying towards that debt. Whereas there's not really any places you're going to get a guaranteed 8% nowadays, or not reasonably, right? If it's less than 7%, you could make the argument that I could make more money by investing. If it's at 6%, if you think you could average 7-8% or something like that, well, then you'd be probably better off by investing that extra money as opposed to paying down that debt. So that's just kind of a general rule of thumb. But as an example, and this isn't personal debt, it's business debt, but we had a client a couple years ago send an email to us and CC'd their CPA. They had a SBA loan. I forget what the interest was. It was fairly high. And these are young guys who, there's 3 owners. They grow through acquisition as part of, they're just kind of an aggressive growth phase, right? And they were like, we got this SBA loan. It was like $300,000 or $400,000 at the time. It cost us, $8,000 a month, the payment on it. Interest on it's $15,000-$20,000 a year, something like that. And they're like, at the time they had I think either like 1.3 or $1.6 million in the bank. And so they're like, we have enough money to pay it off. So like, should we pay it off or should we not? So CPA kind of very quickly was like, yep, I think you should pay it off. And I don't view what I do as, and if somebody asks my opinion, I'll give it to them, but I view it as like, I'm here to help you make decisions and give you the information necessary and the context and perspective to help you make the decision, not tell you what I think is going to be best for you based on my opinions and so on. So I didn't really give them an answer. I said, well, all right, if we take a look at this, by paying, you have plenty of money to pay it off. By paying it off, you're going to free up $8,000 a month in cash flow. You're going to save $15,000, $20,000 a year in interest, and you're going to get the monkey off your back by getting the debt paid off. All objectively good things. However, if you don't pay it off and you just continue to pay it like you're doing, I said, well, if you do pay it off though, you're going to lose that, that $300,000 or $400,000 you no longer have access to. It's effectively gone, right? So, if some of the things that you guys are trying to do, some of the acquisitions you guys are trying to do, they were trying to buy a commercial property, find a commercial property to purchase at the time, all these things. I was like, well, you just no longer have access to that capital. So if you do pay it off, you no longer have access to that capital. That might keep you from doing some of the things that you're doing. So, as long as you have that perspective and context, y'all do whatever you think is best. And they ended up not paying it off because that's what they felt like. Again, with that context, they felt like that was what was best for them. And it was a good thing they didn't, because a couple of months later, they found a commercial piece of property and they needed that cash to be able to help them purchase that property. So again, there's not always a very hard and fast. I kind of dislike some of the financial personalities and stuff out there that say, no, you must do this and you have to do that, and this is the only way to do this, and so on and so forth. I'm like, well, it's really not almost ever really that cut and dry, right? So there's lots of factors at play, and you gotta take them all into consideration when making that decision. So for any of the business owners out there who have debt, either personally or as part of their business, I hope some of that information or context helps you make the decision. So first of all, know the details of the debt. Know all the details. How much you owe, what the payments are, what the interests are. Is it fixed? Is it variable? all those things. Know how much you owe, know how much your net worth is, and how much your business is worth, and all those other sorts of things. But I think having the information first and knowing it, kind of back to the knowing your numbers conversation, extraordinarily important, because then that helps you. Without the information, without the good, accurate information, you can't appropriately make the decision because you don't have the information necessary to help you make the decision. So, but I'm hoping that information is going to be particularly helpful for the people out there with some debt.
Yeah, and so I think it's worth thinking about that. Everything's situational, right? It just depends, and probably to a certain extent, situations can change in this too. So say, hey, if we started out with this, it going back to snowball and avalanche. Maybe we're going to start off with avalanche because we're going to make that make sense, but then something pops up and you're like, you know what? For the next 6 months, we're going to have to go snowball because maybe for whatever reason, right?
Sure.
We don't have as much to put towards avalanche, but snowball is better than nothing.
Right.
But so probably also it's worth saying that once you start down the road, it doesn't necessarily mean you're locked into that road as well.
Yeah, the plan should always be flexible because things do change. And especially if you're a business owner, things are changing all the time, right?
Sure.
And what's going on in business is absolutely going to affect personal finances as well. So, generally speaking, I think having some ability to evolve the plan and some kind of built-in flexibility to the plan is going to be enormously important. The next thing I'll say is about just kind of investing in general and or retirement planning. So I'll start with kind of general of retirement planning. So a lot of business owners, and if you're young out there, you're a younger business owner, one of our kind of main overarching message to business owners is getting and keeping your business what we call sale ready, whether you plan to sell or not.
Sure,
And
absolutely.
because we will all exit our business in some way. At some point, we're either going to die or become disabled, or we're going to sell it or pass it down to kids or whatever it is, but we're not going to live forever. And you might be young and have a lot of energy right now and say, oh, I never plan to retire. And like, well, that's all fine and good. And that might absolutely be the case. But I can tell you from working with a lot of business owners, or just kind of a lot of people in general, but a lot of business owners, that once you kind of get a little bit, in your 50s, 60s, so on, you don't have the same level of energy, you don't have the same mindset, and you're not as gung-ho about working forever. And if you've put yourself in the situation where you have to work forever,
right,
and you'd really prefer not to, well, then you find yourself in quite the pickle, right?
Sure.
So I just think beginning with the end in mind is always very important. But same thing when it comes to retirement planning and when it comes to business. I personally believe, so most business owners, the majority of their wealth is in their business, statistically speaking. Real estate is kind of a very, very distant second for a lot of business owners. And then whatever else they have is an even more distant third or fourth or what have you, right? So generally it's going to be the value of their business, and then the value of any real estate, and then whatever else they have. So same thing as it pertains to that same example that I gave you earlier. It's not so much how much you have saved or invested when you go to retire. So a lot of people are like, well, I want to sell the business for X amount of dollars, $10 million. All right, well, why that number? Sounds like a lot of money. I don't know. So it's a nice big round number. I'm not really sure. I'm like, all right, well, like, do you need that amount? Like what are the needs? So we got to start there. So when we're doing retirement planning for business owners, if they plan to sell the business one day or things like that, if you do plan to sell the business one day, I could not tell you how many business owners do not understand the value of their business at all. They don't even know what it is, much less if they do know what it is, they really don't know what makes up the value and what attributes to that value. So I think knowing those things is incredibly important. And what's the saying? Failing to prepare. That's not the whatever the saying is, but
Yeah,
You know what I'm
failing
talking
to plan is planning for
about?
failure.
Planning to fail. There you go. Thank you. But so a lot of, if you're not tracking it, if you don't understand the business, then how are you coming up with this number? So people will say, well, I plan to sell the business for 10 million one day. All right, well, how much is it worth right now? I don't know. Well, then what's the,
How do you get
what
there?
yeah, what's the plan to get to 10 million? So again, you gotta kind of start there, and you gotta track that throughout the years and so on. But same deal. It's like, all right, well, maybe you need 10 million, maybe you need less, maybe you need more. So kind of reverse engineering it, instead of, again, how much do I need to have saved or invested when I go to retire? Not unimportant, but we need to
Sure.
reverse engineer how much you need to have saved based on your income needs. Same thing with your business. If your plan is to sell your business and sail off into the sunset one day, instead of focusing on, well, I want to sell it for this amount, let's focus on how much you need to sell it for based on your needs and wants. And then at
Mm,
least we have a bottom dollar. And then
sure.
anything more that you sell it for, great.
Icing on the cake.
There you go. Yep. Um, but without knowing that number, because again, 10 million might sound like a big number. That 16 million that guy sold his business for, nice big number. But
Yeah.
he needed way more than that, right? So
Well,
he
and
probably
I think there's something there we're talking about too, is that $16 million 10 years ago is very different than $16 million today, which will very likely be very different than 25 years from now.
yep,
The numbers probably aren't, they're important,
true.
but saying, hey, yeah, if I had $16 million today, I could live pretty well. Okay, but what happens if there's another inflationary event in between here, or a couple? Who
Yeah,
knows? What if is? I think maybe people get a little bit too wrapped up in numbers too, to say, because cost of living today is much different than even 5 years ago, 6 years ago, right? So
yep.
yeah, I think that probably needs to be taken into perspective too, is that you maybe plan for more. Maybe just plan to have extra is worth taking a look at.
100%. I just think that generally our focus is in the wrong place,
Sure. Yeah.
right? So I just think we're focusing on the wrong things.
Yep.
And again, it just comes down to, just we don't know what we don't know, right? So, but I will say, I think that for most businesses, so having said all that, my personal belief is wisely reinvesting back into a well-run business is going to be one of the best returns on capital that you can do, from a tax perspective, from a return on capital perspective, from all sorts of reasons, right? Um, However, caveats being wisely reinvesting into a well-run business, big
Yeah.
caveats there. Um, but having said that, I'm not saying don't diversify outside of the business, whether that be real
Sure.
estate, whether that be the stock market, whatever. I do
Yeah.
think a multifaceted approach is usually the best approach. Um, and a lot of people say, well, I can control the business. And it's like, well, yes, you can control a lot of elements of the business, but there are
Sure.
certainly things that you cannot control. You can't control employees. You can't control the regulatory environment, the tax
Mhm.
environment, the economy in general, right? So, I
Right.
mean, this year, I've heard from a lot of fence builders that this year has been kind of a slower year, and it's like, well, if could you control that or could you not? Because if you could, you wouldn't. You know what I mean? So like,
Right.
just now, granted, you have more control over your business than you do
Yeah.
a stock you bought or any of that other sort of
Right.
stuff. But
Absolutely.
um, I do think first priority for a lot of business owners should be wisely reinvesting back into a well-run business. I think for a lot of business owners, depending on the business, but let's, obviously focus on the fence industry. Depending on your business and where you are, I do think owning commercial property that you run your business out of is a great wealth building and tax management tool, and all that other, and
Hmm.
diversification and all those things. I do
Hmm.
think that's great. I do think there's ways to do that well and then not so well. And
Sure.
again, I think just having somebody you can talk to about those things, and
Yeah.
make sure you're thinking of all the things that we may not know to think about. And then from there, I think investing, let's say, in retirement planning or something like that, whether that be IRAs, simple IRAs, 401ks, Roth IRAs, whatever that means for you, is a worthwhile tool as well. But again, there are ways to do that. All of those things. There's ways to do them really well and really wisely. And then there's ways to do them in a little bit of a haphazard way that may not squeeze as much juice out of the turnip as we want, right?
Yeah. Well, and so you talked about commercial real estate that you operate your business out of, and that touches a little bit on what got talked about at the business conference. In that, so this fence company, right? So we're sitting on commercial land that we own. We're operating it with vehicles that we own, with equipment we own. But right now, and this we're learning, right? Right now, these are all in the same basket, right? These are all owned by a overall LLC. So one thing I took away was, now it files as an S corp for taxes, but so one of the things that I picked up on, and what's funny is we have talked about this before, but it's funny where you can hear the same thing 3 or 4 times, but get different pieces out of that conversation, or be ready to hear different pieces of information. So that was one of the things that got discussed, was that your operating business, so say this fence company, should likely be in a different entity than the equipment, the trucks, tools, etc. Well, maybe not tools, but equipment. And those should be separate again from the commercial real estate for a variety of reasons, right? But we're learning. I'm learning. But that was one of the things I'd gotten out of that was, so we have a fractional CFO we work with, and so I was like, hey, this is. So we'll set quarterly priorities. So it's like, hey, let's add this on the priority list for first quarter, so that we at least have this conversation to talk about what this looks like. Because, and this ties into estate planning, all of this stuff is so intertwined. But I mean, I've got several kids, right? And so part of me thinks about, all right, what are we going to do in the future to make sure, because we're building this. I am building this for them, right? And everyone's doing it for their own reasons. So I don't want to lump anyone in anything, but I think a lot of people would hold that sentiment, that we're building this for the next generation.
Absolutely.
Maybe not, and that's fine. But so that conversation leads into this. Like, what happened? What if 2 out of 3 of the kids have no interest in the business, right? They say, I want to go be a dentist, or I want to go, who knows? Who knows? Okay. Well, so selling them the business probably isn't the greatest idea if they have no interest in it. The business is probably going to suffer for that. But now, because I attended the conference, I was ready to hear this. We split this into different entities. It's like, okay, well, maybe then the dentist would be interested in the property that is being leased by the company that one of the other kids runs.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah.
There's a lot of possibilities here.
Yeah. So that was actually during my talk, because I was the one that went over that. Yeah. So, and again, this is not something that I'm not telling everybody, if you're in that situation, to go. Sure. It's not for everybody, right?
This is where we say you should consult with a professional before making any decisions like this, who is familiar with your situation.
That's right. Yeah. Work with your team on it to make sure it makes sense for you. Because a lot of CPAs are going to tell you not to go that route. Most attorneys are going to tell you to go that route. So you're going to hear different things for different reasons, which I could get into at some point. But yeah, so I mean, separating those things out, there are potentially some tax reasons. There are some, potentially some reasons not to. The biggest reason typically is just that extra layer of asset protection or liability protection. It's just an extra layer. So in the case that, you got a bunch of vehicles on the road, somebody, one of your guys gets in a wreck and hurts or kills somebody, they try to sue you. They usually can't directly come after the operating company. Again, assuming things are done correctly, they can't come after the operating company, which is the company that holds probably most of the assets and most of the money and most of the income's coming into and all those things. So you'd separate that out into a separate business entity. And then the operating company would pay a lease payment to the entity that holds that commercial real estate or the vehicles and equipment or what have you. And generally speaking, like I said, during the presentation, is in today's tax environment, most businesses are filing as an S corporation. Most of the time, it does not make sense for real estate to be owned by an S corporation. And then if you have an operating company that you're running your business out of that is producing the income that you might sell at some point, and then that business entity also holds the real estate that you're running your business out of, most businesses that are out there purchasing other businesses, let's say private equity or whatever firms like that, they're usually in the business. They're not in the real estate business, right?
Yeah.
So they probably just want to buy your business. They probably don't want to buy that real estate. So if you're coming down, and anybody who has ever sold a business or gone through that process knows that it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. So if there are extra unnecessary complexities like having the commercial property owned by that business entity, it kind of muddies the waters a little bit on the numbers. And then it's going to be a whole thing to kind of separate that out into a different business entity upon the, it's just, there's just so many reasons to potentially, get that done ahead of time before we get there, as opposed to doing it at that time. But again, to your point, make sure you work with your team or, rely on some professionals.
Right. And Jeff Long spoke on that similar subject when he was talking about mergers and acquisitions. This whole land holding company question came up in that also. And he said, listen, and he said that exact sentiment. He said, hey, if I'm private equity and he's been in the room when these conversations are happening, he says, we don't want the property. We don't want to buy the property. We'll help you split it off, and we will likely gladly lease that property back from you, but we don't want it to be part of everything else we're doing. Because to your point, we're in the business of owning businesses and operating businesses and growing businesses. We're not in land management or maintenance or any of that business. That's a different deal. So and this all probably harkens back to the best time to do these things is when you don't need to do them, right? There's no deadline. There's no time crunch. Because those are adding stress to a situation. It's incentivizing you to get it done quick, which means you're not taking a second or third look at documents. You're not stepping back to consider maybe full ramifications. Whereas if you did it, you say, hey, I've got no plan to. Perfect. This is the time. It's because you've got all the time in the world to really think about this, to really go through it. You're not pushing whoever on, your professional team that you're not pushing them for answers and adding stress onto their decision-making process either. This is the time. Yeah. And so for that person that says, hey, I'm not ready to sell. I'm not ready to do it. Great. Then that means this is the time for you. It's a good indication. Now, if you are, then the best time to do it was like a couple of years ago, but the next best time to do it is right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's really tough for business owners. And I know we're running out of time. I had one more thing I want to discuss about retirement planning.
Of course.
Yeah, it's really tough for business owners because, running a business is very hard. And the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month keeps you on the hamster wheel. And so it's very hard to get off the hamster wheel long enough to do some of these things that don't directly make you money, that don't, just kind of unfun, unsexy, all that stuff. But I just would encourage you, hit time out, pump the brakes, take some time to do that stuff. It's, you're going to feel better afterwards. It may not be just like most other things that are very rewarding when you get it done. The journey is usually not, not a piece of cake, but then the juice is worth the squeeze on the back end. But
and a lot of these things can probably be chunked into smaller tasks too. So It's not like I got to take 20 hours this week to figure this out. It is, okay, if I do 5 hours this week and 6 hours next week, and a lot of that just comes into time management. And maybe the first step is I don't have a professional that I can talk to freely about this. Step one is take 2 hours this week and find that person, find several people, sit down Yeah, figure out which one, because you could have, and I'm going to just pull. Well, you could have CPAs. We'll just pull a random profession.
Yep.
Three CPAs that their experience is the same, their education's the same, whatever. They look the same on paper, but now we're dealing with personalities, right? And because they're in a journey professionally also, right? So maybe they're saying, "Hey, I'm kind of out of the phase where I'm getting into it with company owners that are in growth mode or whatever. I just want to do planning for now. Like that's just where I'm at." You really got to find the professional that's most aligned with, here's where I'm going, here's what my plan is. Does it sound like it's a good fit for you? Where are you at? What are, you know what I mean? It is an interview. It is an interview both ways, really.
Yep. Yeah, and I think just like with most things, being intentional, going in prepared, having a list of questions that you want to ask, not just going in blindly and things like that. Knowing what to ask, knowing what are good questions and what are not, and so on and so forth. And then, yeah, it's not just like you said, it's, credentials and experience is important, but it's not just that. It's also personality. If you really kind of don't like this person or don't like spending time with them, like this is a relationship with that person that you want to be able to like them at least somewhat, or,
of course,
or be able to trust them and all those things. But, one more thing, and because I know we're running low on time, that I wanted to talk about as far as retirement planning goes. So, like, let's say you are making contributions, let's say to a simple IRA, 401k, Roth IRA, traditional IRA, what have you. I think understanding the short-term and long-term tax ramifications of those things, because a lot of times, so there's pre-tax or tax deductible, and then there's after-tax or like Roth or something that will be tax-free on the back end. So I think just kind of, So I think just kind of making sure you understand how that stuff works. So if you're making pre-tax or tax deductible contributions, let's say to a simple IRA, 401k, traditional IRA, what have you, you get a tax deduction this year on those contributions. So it saves you tax dollars this year. Objectively a good thing. Keep in mind, however, that what you put in and the gains at some point in the future after you retire, typically 59 and a half, age 59 and a half is when you can access that money without an early withdrawal penalty. All the money you put in and the gains will be taxed as income as you go to pull that money out. So I'll never forget, I've used this story for years because it's always stuck out to me. So earlier on in my career, meeting with a gentleman, helping him transition into retirement. He had about $1 million in his 401k, all pre-tax. Money hasn't been taxed yet, and it'll be taxed as he's pulling it out. And so I'm like, great, you have $1 million in here. How much of this money is yours? And he looks at me like I have 3 heads, and he's like, I don't know what you mean. It's all mine. I said, well, no, this money hasn't been taxed yet. So part of it belongs to you. Part of it belongs to the IRS. So how much of it is yours and how much belongs to the IRS? And he was like, well, I guess I haven't really thought about it that way. I guess maybe 700,000 or so is mine. I said, great. Well, then we need to create a retirement plan based on $700,000 of this money being yours to use and spend in retirement.
Right.
Now, let's assume they change the tax code and you're retired, and now all of a sudden $600,000 of this is yours instead of $700,000. That changed the retirement plan. Of course it does. And what are your options at that point? You have 4, or at least 4 that I know of. 1, you can go back to work if that's an option. 2, you can live off of less money per month or per year if that's an option. 3, you can invest that money more aggressively and take on more risk to try to make up the difference, which most retirees are not exactly keen on.
Sure.
Or 4, you can hope you die sooner. Right. So none of those options are very good. Right. So
none of those are winners.
No. So I just think a lot of, if you're relying on your CPA for tax advice, 9 times out of 10, in my experience, that will be there are CPAs for like retirement planning or investment advice. That's generally going to be their advice. Hey, make this contribution to this thing so you get a tax write-off this year, because what they are focused on is saving you tax dollars this year. The more they can reduce your taxes this year, the more of a hero they are. And I get it. And I understand where they're coming from. And I am not saying don't ever make pre-tax or tax deductible contributions to something, because for some people it makes total sense.
Right.
However, I think just understanding how this stuff works, again, being intentional instead of just kind of blindly following advice and just like,
Right.
hey, I get an immediate, tax deduction. Okay, well, how does this work later down the road?
Later on. Yeah.
Exactly. So,
the way I heard it put was, like a lot of people, I get information from TikTok, for better or worse.
Sure.
But the conversation was talking about, the question was, do you think that the tax rates will go down in the next 20 years or go up? Which is more probable when we're talking about national debt, when we're talking about just what do you think? Do you think they're going to ask for more money or less money in the future? Well, pretty good bet they're going to ask for more. Okay. And so I understand the other side of the argument too is you are making a lot of money right now. You are probably at a higher tax rate basis than you would be in the, later on. Maybe, but there's both sides to the coin. You're likely going to pay more tax later, but maybe you're at a point where you're not. But the problem there, Andrew, is you're trying to place the current administration and the current taxes, and you're trying to apply those to 20, 25 years in the future, where it's like, well, okay, maybe. So, and this is just what I do. This is not whatever. Maybe a thought is to do both, right? Yeah. Do some pre, some post, and just say, hey, we're going to hedge our bets. We're going to pay some tax. Yep, we're going to pay some tax on these dollars. We're going to defer some tax on these dollars. Yep. But there's some people that argue like, no, this is non-taxed. This is no. It's that the contribution is not taxed, and the growth, you're going to pay tax when you pull that out. Now, the fact that you think the government's not going to tax a dollar is wild when they have the ability to.
I literally had a buddy tell me one time, he's like, well, I know that you don't have to pay taxes when you retire. And I'm like, what, where did you get that? That is something you literally just made up. Like, I don't know who.
Right. Right. Let me in on that plan.
Yeah. However that works, I need to know. But yeah, to your point, I ask a lot of those same questions when I'm talking to somebody. I was like, all right, so do you believe taxes will go up or down over the next 20, 30 years? Yeah. I've never heard anybody say they think they'll go down. Everybody either says, well, I don't know. Probably 2 out of 10 say, I don't know. 8 out of 10 say, oh yeah, they're going to go up.
They're going up. Sure.
So if you believe that, you can't also use the argument that you'll be in a lower tax bracket when you retire.
Right.
Because a number of reasons, and especially if you own a business. One, if you're in a higher tax bracket now, you're probably going to be in a higher tax bracket later, because you're going to want your quality of life to be the same. And even if taxes were to stay the same, and if you own a business, you get a lot of tax deductions that you are not going to have when you retire, assuming that you don't own a business when you retire. And so there's a lot of things that, if we're honest with ourselves, are really kind of personal expenses that we get to write off as business expenses that you're just not going to have when you go to retire. So you just get to, you get a lot of tax incentives now that you're not going to get later. And so there's nothing, you can kind of manipulate and get creative with some things now that you're just not going to be able to do when you go to retire. So,
well, in a way, I think people don't think about it is those withdrawals are income. Like you aren't not having income. You have money. You're just withdrawing it for 401k and taking it as income to you personally. So you do still have income. The more you want to pull out is the more you are making, the more income you have coming into your personal financial situation.
And there's a ripple effect, not just your federal income taxes. When you retire, there's a ripple effect that not a lot of people are aware of. Your income will determine how much, when you retire, will determine how much of your Social Security is taxed. If married, finally, jointly, if you make over $44,000 a year, 85% of your Social Security is taxed as income. A lot of people don't realize that. Your Medicare premiums are also income dependent as well. The more money you make, the higher your Medicare premiums are, and there are big jumps in there. So like we're working with clients now that like just sold businesses and things like that. and their retirement age, they're over 65, things like that. And they're like, oh my gosh, the Medicare premiums are ridiculous. And I'm like, well, we can go back and file life change stuff and get that taken care of for the future. But yeah, I mean, if that were, anyways, so there's just these ripple effects that not a lot of
Yeah.
people are aware of as they're doing this. That again, I think beginning with the end in mind, I think being intentional pretty much always, but particularly as it comes to like business planning, financial planning, estate planning, things, tax planning, things like that. Are almost always going to serve you way better than just focusing on the here and now.
Absolutely. Well, and just, considering like follow on impacts as well. Like, hey, if I do this, then that's going to lead to these 2 or 3 things further on down the road. To your point, like I hadn't even thought about the fact that after I retire, so there's going to be Medicare implications and unemployment. Like now, this is all like taking into account that we're thinking that there will be unemployment or there will be Social Security in the future. It's again, you can't take today's situation and apply it to 20 years in the future.
Sure.
But Andrew, I feel like so the time's we're winding down the time, but we've gotten to about this much of the conversation yet again because there's so much to it. And I think maybe this is one of the this is an area that I struggle with. I think a lot of people do. They try to simplify it to say, oh yeah, planning, good. Investing, good. This, like, well, yes, but which is the better way, right? Like, do you do investing? We're just talking about, do you do pre or post tax investing in retirement? Well, it depends, right? It's situational.
Well, and I'll just say, I would imagine most of the people that are probably taking time out of their day to listen to your podcast to get good information, people that go to these conferences and things like that. I'm assuming that anybody listening, the way they run their business is that good enough isn't good enough. Right. So why should your planning be any different, right? Good enough in your planning isn't good enough, right?
Bingo.
It is super important. And I think taking a little bit of extra time is going to pay off down the road in multiple ways.
Well, and I would hazard to guess a lot of the people that you deal with that do the proper planning, that take the time, very few, maybe none of them regret that. At the end saying, man, I really put too much time into planning. I really had too good of a plan together, as opposed to the alternate. People say, man, I really wish I had thought this through before insert major event.
Yeah, I think it's about 1,000,000 to 1, one versus the other, right? So
yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
Andrew, thank you so much. I know Saturday mornings is not a ideal time segment to get into. I appreciate you and your family making time for you to come on and talk to us about this.
I appreciate that, man. And as always, I really appreciate you having me on. I always love doing this. I hope people get a lot of value from it, but I really enjoy the experience and can't tell you how much I appreciate you thinking enough of me to have me on.
Oh, listen, Andrew, I'm learning from me. I'm sure there's people out there that are also getting information and getting tidbits from this. And that's how I view the show in general. Like, I'm curious. So I want to learn all these things. And there's a good chance there's other guys out there that want to learn these things as well. No, I appreciate you coming on so often. Andrew, if someone wanted to reach out and continue this conversation with you directly, how would they reach out to you?
Yeah, so we can always do free phone calls, consultations, stuff like that. So, I get questions all the time about, hey, can I call you and pick your brain about this? Happy to pay for it. We're not going to charge for stuff like that because sometimes people just need some good, friendly advice. So, atlasfinancialstrategies.com is our website. Our office number is 850-542-4803. Feel free, anybody listening, I'm happy to take some time for a phone call. You can reach out to me on social media and stuff like that too. I try to be available, so feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to help you if I can.
Well, I know you're very active in the Facebook groups, the fencing Facebook groups. I mean, I want to just thank you for being so available, not only just for this show, but in general to you. You're one of the guys, in my perspective, you're one of the guys that has a kind of that servant's heart mentality. It's like, I want to be as helpful to the most amount of people that I possibly can. And I mean, I appreciate it. I know the industry appreciates it as well. Just you're being so open and honest and willing to help.
Well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. Yeah. And that's the goal. Try to help as many people as possible, but I appreciate that. And thank you again for having me on.
Of course. I appreciate you making time. Guys, appreciate you guys sticking around as well. Guys, if you're listening to this on the podcast, one, thank you for making it to the end. Two, if you'd like to participate in the conversations live and have your questions answered live, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn /Joe Everest is a pretty good place to start to find these conversations most every Saturday, starting at 10 a.m. Central, and they wind down when the conversation gets to a good ending point. We'll say that. For now, I'm Joe Everest, the fence expert, reminding you that good fences, Andrew,
make good neighbors.
Bingo, nailed it. I always hesitate because I never get anyone ready for that, but very good. Oh, guys, we'll see you next time.